Hello guys, I wanted to show you something here. I wanted to show you about something called vector. Okay, so in order for me to be able to show you that, let me just remind you about what we did last time. Okay, so we wrote a program that was reading marks from a file called ph127.txt, and then we were trying to calculate the average of the marks of students in PH 127. And thereafter, after calculating the average, we tried to find out how many students scored below the average. Okay, but you remember how we did it? We first of all created an object for reading data from this particular file. Okay, that is stored on the desktop. So we had to write the full path to that file, and we had to specify that this object, we are creating it specifically so as to read from that file, so as to take input from that file. Okay, so we put iOS in to mean we are taking input from that file. Thereafter, we said if that file does not exist, what do you want to do? You want to display a message, cannot open file. However, if the file exists, we declared a variable called score. We also initialized the sum to what? To 0. You see? And then we are saying whenever you successfully read marks from that file, okay? So we are using this object to read marks from a file, okay? And we are using double greater than because double greater than is a symbol for reading data. You see? Yeah. So we are saying whenever you successfully read a score from that file, save it into this variable here, into variable score. Okay? Yeah. And once you save it and you are successful, you see this line here will return a value similar to true whenever you successfully read and save a variable. This line here will return a value that is similar to true whenever you successfully read a value from that file and successfully save it into this variable. You see? Yeah. And so if we get that true, okay, we will be able to get inside the loop and sum that value, and also we want to count it. You get my point? We want to count it in order to know how many marks are there. You see? And then a time will come when we are going to reach the end of the file. A time will come when we are going to reach the end of a file where there are no more marks. So at that particular moment, when we try to read a value, it means there is nothing to read. So our object will fail. It will return a value similar to false. And so it means our loop will terminate, because whenever you have false inside, it means you can't get inside the loop. You get my point? At that particular moment, execution will continue here at line number 16. So here we are going to calculate the average by taking the sum divided by the total number of marks in that file. Okay, divided by the total number of marks in that file. And once we are done, it means we are going to have what? The average. At that particular moment, we decided to close our file because we saw that we have already calculated the average, so we closed the file. Okay, so in order to count those who were below the average, you see, in order to count those who were below the average, we had to initialize a certain variable to 0, you see, and then we had to go back to our file, you see, to read each mark one at a time, you see. And whenever we read a mark, we check, is this mark below the average? If so, we count it. Okay, that is how we did it, you see. And then at the end here, we are displaying that the average is equal to this, and those who are below the average this much, you see. Yeah. Now I want you to see something. You might ask yourself, why did we close the file and then here we are opening it again? Why did we do that? So if you remember, if we close this file here, if we don't close this file here, you see, and we choose to continue using that object without closing the file, what will happen is that once this loop, this do you see this first loop here? Okay, once this loop completes, you see, the cursor inside our object which we are using to read data will have reached the end of our file. It will be at the very end of our file, you see. So when we come to use that object again here, it will fail because it will say that I couldn't read any mark, you see. And when the object fails, it means it will return a value similar to false, and we will not be able to get inside this loop here, you see. And so it will just tell us that below the average we are 0. You get my point? So in order to solve this problem, we had to do this. We had to do something like this. We had to close that file, and then we had to open it afresh here. When we open it afresh, it means the cursor in this object here will start at the very top again, you see. And so we will again be able to read the first mark, and we will check it. If it is below the average, we will count it. And then since we are inside the loop, it will come back here again. It will try to read another mark. If it successfully reads, it comes inside again. We check if it is below the average, and then we count it like that. So this is how we did it, you see. Yeah. But again, we said that there is a disadvantage of using this method, okay? Because imagine you are closing the file at first, and then you're opening it again, you see. Now there is a bit of a disadvantage because why didn't we just save the values into an array initially, and then instead of having to open the file here a second time, we could just use the values that are inside our array. You get my point? That would have been better. Using an array would have been better because an array is inside RAM while the file is on the hard disk. You get my point? Now, accessing data that is stored on the hard disk, accessing a file that is stored on the hard disk is more time consuming compared to accessing something that is on the RAM. Okay, the RAM is much closer to your program compared to the hard disk. So in other words, going to access data from a file twice, you see, at first here, and then we close, and then we go back again here to the same file. It means we are making our program to be using a lot of time, you see. You are not sensing that because here we don't have so many marks and things like that. But the idea is that it is not a very good practice, okay? It is better that when you access the file the very first time, you should have saved the values into an array so that when you need to use those values later, you could just use them from your array instead of having to go back to the file again. You get my point? Yeah. So that was the shortcoming of using this method, okay? Yeah. Someone else would have said that maybe instead of closing the file, we could have used a certain function to take the cursor back to the top. Yes, we could have done that. There is a function that can take the cursor back to the top of the file. But again, you are going back to read from that file a second time. That is not a very good idea, okay? It will work, but it is not a very good idea. So I wanted to show you that. And then in the second approach, we tried to use an array, okay? So let me pause this video here. Let me end this video here, and then let me show you the second approach which we did, okay? I'm trying to introduce to you something good, but before I introduce it, I want first of all to show you what we did before so that when I introduce the new thing, you'll be able to understand. Thank you. let me head to the next video.